like defining a creature as essence plus existence makes sense to me. Where that comes from, like his reasoning behind that.
I don't remember those terms being used so much. He kind of mentioned them though.
Yeah, so essence would be the form, and then existence would be like the actual substance.
Mm-hmm. I don't fully understand Aristotle's conception of matter exactly. I do a little bit.
I think yeah, it was interesting because I think he is not. If I'm reading this right, not that matter.
Yeah, Perl doesn't like the word substance as the translation for Usia.
For matter?
Yeah, like he basically says that like a better way of looking at Usia is like looking at it the same way that Plato, like like how he translated like the form as like the reality of something, like its reality or its realness or whatever.
Its whatness.
So he basically says that that's a better way of understanding what Usia is supposed to mean in Aristotle, and that like the word substance really screws up people's.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. He ended up talking about that. But one thing that's weird though, that I kind of, because like I don't think Perl touched on it. I'm thinking maybe Gerson does, because he also does a similar, like, and he actually references Gerson in here too, actually. Talking about how like Aristotle actually is like in continuity with Plato, and like the argument makes perfect sense. But then I'm wondering, like, we have like explicit phrases also where Aristotle is saying, "Oh, I don't agree with Plato on blah blah blah" or whatever, right? And like the whole famous phrase that he has, right, where it's like, "Oh yes, dear to me is Plato, but dear to me is truth," or whatever, or something like that. So it's like what I'm wondering is that like if he's explicitly trying to say that he's in opposition to some extent, but then we're arguing that he obviously wasn't. So like was like it's interesting how like, because Aristotle was like one of the like direct students of Plato, right? Like he was like in the the earliest parts of the academy. Like he was he saw Plato, he was contemporary with Plato. And so like how is it, and like if you look at the Neoplatonists too, like the Neoplatonists will say that like Aristotle was a bit like, the way they justify it is that, oh well, a lot of it works, but Aristotle was a bit dull, a bit slow, and he just didn't realize blah 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 or whatever. But like it doesn't seem like that when you look at what he, you know what I mean? Like so it's like he seems, and especially like if you say he came to the same conclusion, how is it that he gets the same doctrine of forms but doesn't think he has the same doctrine of forms that Plato does? Because that's what ends up being argued here, is that actually form in Aristotle is not different. And that's one of the things that like people say is the most contentious thing, is that actually, Aristotle's idea of form is different. It's completely different from Plato's, and that it's a lot more grounded or whatever. But like Pearl's arguing here that actually their doctrine of forms matches perfectly. But then why does Aristotle not know that that's the case? It's weird. It's what I find weird. Yeah, he mentions hylomorphism. Yeah, like he talks about how like there's actually a big misconception. Like he's basically like, and the argument's good because when you actually look at the things Pearl cites, you can see, right, like how he actually shows, like that this is an interpretation of Aristotle that makes more sense if you really look at all these statements. But why doesn't he know that then, right? Like why would he have made such a weird misconception of like, or like, it's understandable how people today might have this whole thing of like thinking that Plato's forms is like a different world, like the whole two worlds theory that Pearl refutes. Why would Aristotle have had that view, being a direct student of Plato? Like it makes no sense whatsoever.
It could be just a definition of words, right? Like different schools tend to take different vocabularies just to be different. Maybe like he's like, I'm not using their terms because I'm the Aristotle school, not the Plato school. I gotta like.
Yeah, but it's a pretty strong statement to say that. Oh yeah, I love Plato to let out the truth better. Like what? like
could it
he's
be
literally
like,
saying that he's wrong in some areas, but it's like, but then Pearl and some people are arguing that no, they agreed pretty much, and so
Mhm.
it's like
could
what?
it be could it be like nuances? And this may be an ignorant question, but like nuances, like where I mean, the whole idea of like trying to find the essence of a thinker, as if they're internally consistent to themselves always, right?
Mhm.
There's no like I'm convinced we're never consistent, even if we think we have a consistent idea. Even an idea that we have probably has an amorphous quality to it, right? So like even the idea of forms, right? I mean, I'm only just on page 30, so that's what I'm. But like Plato and his forms, right? And, like Pearl's way of seeing it as the whatness or whatever, right? Versus that whole divine double kind of like a heavenly kind of sphere of these forms that maps onto. Like, Eric, I'm sure, I mean, I don't know all this stuff well enough to know, but I'm sure that Pearl's reading of this stuff is probably seen by other scholars, Plato and Aristotle, as idiosyncratic, right? But can we see, like, for example, but there might be some truth to it, right? It might be a true angle, and he wants to read it in this way and see continuity between them two. But can we also see, to your point, Navid, maybe there was a dimension of Plato that, like, I'm somewhat aware. I think he respected like the Pythagorean stuff, and that has this kind of like the mathematical stuff up there, like this heavenly and this kind of like, and there must be truth to the whole Plato up here, Aristotle down here kind of thing, even in just temperament as well as the kind of things they like to focus on, right? So can we see it? I mean, is it simplistic to say is a little bit of a vibe difference? Where like,
Well, yeah, I mean they are definitely talking about, like, they have different focuses, right? So the whole this and that thing is right. And if you look at like the subjects or the things that Aristotle spends more time talking about,
Aristotle
and
being like
like
the first Darwin. He goes to an island. He wrote a whole biologia trait, like,
yeah, like
he records all the different animals, the animals he dissects and their ecosystems and their migration patterns and stuff, like kind of like a Darwin, that goes to an island and like traces all that down and thinks he comes up with the whole idea of how it all works. Aristotle did it first.
right. So like, yeah, so there's no doubt like that, like there's it doesn't, like, of course it doesn't make sense to just say like, oh, Aristotle is, just a Platonist, right? Because there's a sense in which he expands the field of what that is and what that means. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? Like, it's fine to look at Aristotle as an individual, as a person in his own right, or as having some kind of originality or doing this or that. Like, all of that is fine. But it's still, what's interesting though is just understanding like it's most of the metaphysics where it gets weird, right? Like, and also his stuff on the soul. Like, is it really continuous and connect with Platonism well, or does it not? And even though like the dominant thesis is that they don't, there are a lot of, like, Pearl's not the only one. A number of heavy hitters are now taking the opposite idea. But again, like, what it doesn't address is that, well, why does Aristotle not know that, if it's the case? Is what the weird, that's the most difficult thing to square away with. Is like, it's one thing if Aristotle never said he disagreed, but we were reading it into that. But when you have statements where he's clearly saying, oh, I am conscious that this sounds not Platonic and it's totally intentional, then you're like, like, do you not take, we should take him on his word, right? Like, if
And
you think,
I
right? I mean,
think
like, what reason
we're
do we
in this
have to just
concept
gloss
of
over that?
this being the classical tradition as opposed to just the Platonic tradition. And I think Pearl wants to point that like Plato is the root that these all emerge from, and he might be overcorrecting the error of like making them like character opposites, as we're talking about the Platonists and the Aristotelians. They're totally different. They're probably much closer because obviously they were like students of each other and like taught in the same time frame and stuff like that. So they can't be so distinct. But you're right. I think we have to. Even Pearl. Actually, I listened to Pearl's lecture. There's a there's a video. His lecture was actually kind of boring. The lecture before Pearl's was actually much more interesting. It was about Saint Victor or something like that. But the discussion before and after his lecture we're talking about this kind of series of influences, Plotinus and Aquinas and Aristotle and Augustine, things like that. And he was doing the same thing though. He was still making that distinction between Plato and Aristotle. He was talking about how he was saying Augustine got a lot of these things right, like from Plato, that are really unique and like powerful for arguing for the existence of God and like the existence of the forms and the eternal and all this stuff. But he's too Aristotelian. He's too like Aristotle. He keeps it there instead of being like Plotinus, who takes it beyond just this certain level of the forms and stuff like that. So he draws that distinction too. I've heard.
Yeah, because even the Neoplatonists, like even though they do synthesize them both and end up like really merging the Aristotle stuff and the Plato stuff, but like even they like still will admit or acknowledge the fact that Aristotle thought himself saying different things to some extent. And so like because when I was looking at the Schwepp podcast thing that I had posted in the Facebook group chat, there's like an episode where it talks about where he mentions that the Neoplatonists kind of treated Aristotle as being like a Platonist who was kind of dense, a little slow, a little like oh yeah, he had a lot of things right, but he was somewhat less, like he was a bit, he was misguided. It was in a very adorable way where like he said a whole bunch of things that were right, but then he just like but he didn't completely get it and kind of went renegade a bit and whatever. And yeah, so it's so like even there, like they're saying it in that way. And so like I guess what I would really want to end up looking at is like, because I haven't read Gerson's book where he makes basically and then like Perl references that book, but I haven't read the actual Gerson book yet. But he also is like one of the humongous heavy hitter scholars now, who is actually going with the whole thing of Aristotle is continuous with Plato.
Well, I wonder if any of them have addressed this, what Aristotle says about.
I'm guessing Gerson probably did, because he's really thorough, and interestingly, he's weird in that he is like he basically seems to be very much a Neoplatonist, or as if he believes in Neoplatonism, but he comes from the analytic philosophy tradition. So he's one of those really weird scholars where like he's technically an analytic, but all his writing is on this continental Platonist stuff.
Who?
And Lloyd Gerson.
Oh.
Yeah, like his language and his way of argumentation is in a lot of ways apparently analytic. The way that he taught that he like forms argument or analyzes argument, but like oddly enough, like his entire work is on explaining Neoplatonism and Platonism. And which is bizarre if you think about it, right? Because you don't normally think of.
I've seen his books. I think I have some of his books when I'm reading this somewhere.
His language is a bit difficult, but also not. Like once you understand the terminology a little bit, he's actually very, very clear. Like that's the thing. Like it's not like what gets in the way with Gerson books is sort of the jargon. Like you have to understand what he means by certain words sometimes. But if you know what those words are, he actually is a very clear, concise writer overall. Like he actually argues in a very simple, pretty straightforward way.
Okay. Could you type his name and the book name in the chat? Yeah,
like the one book that I do have of his is the one on Plotinus. It's just called Plotinus, where he basically just does an explication of his entire thought.
Okay. Cool.
Which is it's a really good book. I do recommend that one for sure. But he's got some other ones that I haven't read, but I have them in PDF. I just haven't gotten around to them. Yeah,
Okay.
he's somebody he teaches at the University of Toronto. But yeah, he's a really big heavy hitter in Neoplatonism scholarship right now.
Okay. Cool.
He gets cited a lot by a lot of
Mhm.
people. But yeah, but he's
I think.
it's interesting.
Hmm.
I had a thunk. I forgot it.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I kind of wanted to see what he thinks about like why does Aristotle say he disagrees?
Yeah.
Because Pearl completely glosses over that. He didn't say anything about those statements. That why does
Well,
Aristotle believe he's
Oh,
believing
Pearl's
something else?
that's what I was gonna say. So I think something we might be missing in this is just a little bit. I read. Who was it? It was either someone that Brian had assigned me to read once upon a time. It wasn't Plotinus. Isn't there a P name for the Neoplatonists?
Proclus?
Proclus. Yeah, it was Proclus. I was like kind of like dipping my toe into some Proclus. And how Proclus treats these guys as like prophets, as
Hmm.
divine, right? That's
Mhm.
something we might be missing. Is we were kind of we're taking like this neutral philosophical look, but Proclus and a lot of Neoplatonists are looking at these guys like every word is code, sacred code. Like
Hmm.
they're interpreting it like Lectio Divina, like they can like look at a single line and that has the meaning of the universe in it. That's how some of the later Neoplatonists are looking at these texts. And so if they read into stuff
Oh
into
yeah, no.
Aristotle, that's probably why, because it's a
Oh
very
no.
much
I mean,
more
I
spiritual
look at
way
it
of
the
looking
same
at it.
way. I look at it the same way. I do see them prophetically. At least that's how it is in my tradition. But it's more that like I would wonder like how they address it, sort of thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
It's like I just
Mhm.
haven't seen them talk about it. So like I'm sure there is an explanation. So it's not like I'm taking the philosophically skeptical. Like I mean, I also do think there's continuity, but like I would just wonder like I just haven't seen somebody say what they make of those statements yet.
Makes me
Yeah.
wonder
In
if the Greek is, if the Greek and Latin of Plato is prettier than the English, because I'm not sure I could see that kind of reference from the way at least the translation I was reading. It feels very dry and flat. There's no kind of King James or anything I'm used to for kind of any kind of elevated language in there.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I wish
but
I'd read the whole Aristotle chapter. I want to know more about how
but I mean,
they.
yeah, I can tell you like just the stuff that I saw in it. We can still
Yeah,
talk about it a bit.
yeah, go
Like
for it.
just sort of how I understood some of the sections, at least that's a good way to start. So like uh yeah, so the first section, which I think okay, so did we all at least read the first part
I read
about
one
Yeah,
and
change?
most of two. Yeah.
yeah, I
Okay,
read
well,
one.
yeah, so yeah, so the doctrine or talking about change is really interesting. I think this is exactly one place where Aristotle talks about more expansively, that Plato doesn't exactly. Like, of course, Pearl is saying that all of the ingredients of the theory of change are in Plato, but obviously, like Aristotle is being more explicit, explicitly talking about or laying out, what change is and how does that factor into the idea of static intelligible realities. Like, how do you go from uh, there being this like a sense in which everything is in one form static but then changeable, and what is
Mm-hmm.
that, how does that happen, where like how do we get that sort of thing happening? And so he basically says that there are different components, or there are different ways in which the object exists. So he says there's a sense in which like there is uh, so it has its form, which he says is like completely purely intelligible and static. But then he says there's matter, and then there's also the reality that comes from matter and form coming together, and that this is something else that's distinct. Because matter, in a sense, is almost something weird between being and non-being. Like it's intelligible to an extent, but not fully. It's kind of amorphous. So he says that like basically this sort of intelligible thing ends up diluting the pure intelligible form. Like he ends up using this like way of talking about wine and water, like how like you can mix them together, but like the water doesn't really become wine per se just by doing that, but there's a sense in which there's something else that results from that, or that it does something with the form or clothes it in a different sort of way. And so there's this way in which matter is diluting or watering down the form and then resulting in this hybrid. And then that hybrid thing then has the properties of change. But he says, of course, change implies those two parts. Like he argues how change is telling you how, in fact, the static and the amorphous exist there together, because the only way you would say something changes is that there is that when you have form, one stage and another stage, right? Like let's say this is how it was in point A, and now it has become this in point B. There's one sense in which you're talking about two different things, right? Like it was this and now it is this. But notice you're saying the word it both times, right? It was, now it is. And so he's saying that there is some aspect of it which does not change, right? That change also involves there being an anchor, or there being some quality or some appearance or look which does not alter, and then other aspects which do alter. Because otherwise you wouldn't really be able to say that this changed into that. You would just say, oh, this thing went out of being and this thing came out of non-being into being, right? Like we wouldn't call it change, right? Change implies this relationality between these two things that seem to be utterly different from each other.
Like the tree and a chair, right? Like it looks totally different. You may relate it to, or like you could even make it a wider difference. Like
I was gonna say like a human being.
Composite parts.
A baby is way different from an adult or an old person, but it's still a human being.
Yeah. So he says change is basically the result of composition. Yeah, like he says composite.
But it's the matter that's unknowable but still changeable. Unknowable, changeable, but still part of being itself. That's kind of what I asked. That's kind of what I asked that question: is the receptacle knowable? And so because Aristotle's saying no, matter is not knowable, but yet it's being. So we can know like just the glimmer of it. I guess we know it's there logically, but we can't see it with like a form.
Yeah, because he's talking about matter in a much more like, not just in the sense of matter as in, like this is when he's talking about matter here, it doesn't look like he's talking just about matter in terms of like physical matter, but he's also referring to like healing, like the prime matter sort of thing. So in a sense, like, so because in a sense, even like our thoughts have a common substance that they're made out of, right? In a weird way, like there is like a certain, like when we're thinking and visualizing, there's a certain weird amorphous canvas that becomes all that stuff that we think about, right? It's not like it's a different thing that we're using. There's some kind of shapeless something that we know is there and we're able to shape it. And that's what I think he calls like as being prime, like prime matter, like the base of matter as we see it in the world. And so
okay.
Yeah,
I see now. Because I remember.
Yeah.
Okay, so go ahead.
So in a sense, it's got this weird thing where he says that it's intelligible and not, right? Like it's intelligible in that we know it's there. That's why we manipulate it. Like the mind is able to manipulate or do things with it. But in its raw form, it is not intelligible completely until it is given a form of some kind. So there's a sense in which the form completes the matter's being. And it sounds actually very quantum if you think about it, right? Like it sounds like the whole thing about like the wave, the collapse sort of thing, like where matter you could say is like something in like when it's just part of quantum reality where it's neither this or that just yet, and then form is like kind of like when that wave equation collapses into a defined something which is fully intelligible and fully measurable, observable, so
Mhm.
on and so forth. So it sounds like that's sort of what's going on there, is that like is matter to some extent is related to like this idea of pure quantum state of things, or like that,
Yeah,
you know,
Werner
which is that,
Heisenberg made that correlation too, talking about how
yeah.
Aristotle preceded the observations of collapsing the waveform or wave function.
Oh,
That's
he
why
made that connection? That's interesting. I didn't know he did that.
that's why Fraser's insistence that this metaphysics is useless in science always seems funny. He's like, these guys are predicting this stuff. You know,
Yeah.
physics goes to a fine later in from a different angle.
Hmm. Well, yeah, but then you got it. But the thing is, we get that impression because we don't, you know, we don't hear those voices, right? Like who, like yeah, we listen to scientists who have read Heisenberg, but does anybody read Heisenberg himself, right?
Yeah.
That's the problem, right? It's again about that whole thing of like getting an interpretation of whatever, you know what I
Oh
mean?
yeah,
That we
sure,
were
yeah.
talking about last time. So that's
Mhm.
partly what it is. It's an issue of perception. Is that like we're not really it's partly to do with the fact that we're not going back to root principles.
I saw a meme. Well, unfortunately, the audience won't be able to see this, but you can find it. There you go. Dang it.
So yeah, so that's kind of what he mostly says when it comes to change. Yeah, it's got a look or intelligibility, non-being itself, matter.
That's what I was referencing, yeah, the other day.
Quad-changeable, a residue of unintelligibility,
Goodness.
can never be discovered by itself.
Oh,
But it's
so
always,
dying.
yeah. Yeah, so matter is there as the changeable thing, which is not form. Okay. So then nature as form is the second section, right?
Navi, this is a tangent. I really appreciate you going over these parts. That's really helpful, and it could be helpful for other people who are reading it too. Once I post it on the YouTube channel. But I have a tangent for you. Does the Shia or Ismaili tradition have a notion of the pre-existence of the soul before life?
Yes. So I think, yeah, we talked, I mentioned it a little bit like in the chat before. That, yeah, so there is this idea. So we kind of basically along the lines, basically that's one reason why I like Origin, because it's a really interesting how he comes to that idea. Though it ends up getting rejected in later orthodoxy, but yeah, but the idea is, yeah, there's this idea of the pre-existence of souls, and so in the sense that, yeah, like the soul is already there before the body, right? It's not something that's considered something that comes into being just when the body is being created. Like that's kind of exactly what Pearl would say is like the weird Aristotle notion, like where like a form only is completely inseparable from the object that has a form, in a sense. Like, so that's one example of how, like, where maybe Pearl would say is that people were reading Aristotle that way. But if we look at it, it doesn't really, he clearly shows that intelligibility can exist, it has to exist, and absolutely can exist without its material container, in a sense, right? Or that substance, when it without it being added, you still can have pure intelligible substance. So there is a sense in which, yeah, the Quran is kind of more explicit about it, where it even talks about the idea that the souls were there and they attested to God's existence. Like it mentions, like, like it mentions, for example, like, like Adam, and then all the souls that would emerge from his loins were all there as particles, like kind of before the Lord, and the Lord's like, am I not, the Lord, am I not your God? And they're all like, yes. And it's like, okay, well then do not say that you did not know later on or something like that.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of those sorts of allusions that go there. And there's also parts, for example, like when I was talking about the free will and why do we exist and did we want to be here sort of thing. And there's a thing which even says something interesting where like is like God is talking to the souls or the beings that are going to come into the world, and he says, okay, who is going to, in a sense, be sort of like where you know what's going to who's going to be sort of in a sense the responsible being over creation in a sense or whatever. I can bring up the exact quote because I want to say this properly, but because I cited it in that one paper that I had written on free will and and all of that stuff. But basically, what it says is that like yeah, so there was like all the souls were asked about the role, this role that needed to be taken on as kind of like the regent of the world or the caretaker of the cosmos. And it says that all the souls that you see that are like the souls of the trees or the rocks or the animals, those are all the souls who were afraid to take on this duty and they refused. They turned it down.
Mm.
And the souls of man are those who accepted and said, yes, we'll do it. Interestingly enough. And then it ends by saying that that man was foolish indeed. In a sense.
That's great.
In that they didn't really understand fully what that was going to mean, right? Or what that would imply. Oddly enough, it ends up being a very ambitious and correct choice, but at the same time, like what he's trying to say is that that when they made that choice, they definitely had no idea in some sense or didn't really understand the implications of what was going to come with that.
That reminds me of
so
like Peter's confession in the New Testament. He's like, "Ah, yes, you are Lord," and like Jesus is like, "Ah, yes, you're right," by saying that. But then I feel like Peter has no clue what he just said, like what he was just appealing to. It's like, "Ah, you're right. I agree with you, God." And he's like, "Good job. Now you're gonna do all this stuff." You're like, "Okay, what?"
Yeah.
And also, like, I'm gonna go die. No, you're not. And he's like trying to tell him.
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
The Son of
he
God.
confesses
What
his
he's
Lord, then denies his crucifixion like right afterwards. Yeah. It's like that's us, humanity. We're like, yes, God, we'll go down there, do your thing, deny you immediately. Fall immediately.
Yeah.
I was gonna ask, the tradition you're talking about, is that in any way related to that saying? I can't remember exactly how it goes, but it's something like the bind oh shoot. It goes from regression from like a rock to a plant to an animal to a person. And it's like consciousness sleeps in a rock, is awakening in a tree, and something like, and then it's fully awakened a human or something like that.
Oh yeah, good thing. Like I was like once I was a rock and once I was an animal and then I became like that sort of thing.
It wasn't like a becoming sort of thing. Oh, let me try to find it real quick.
Yeah, this is the exact quotation of what I was just saying.
I love that quote.
Yeah, we offered the trust. Yeah, so the trust is in a sense like. Yeah, it's Rumi. Yeah, that's what I was about to say. I'm like, yeah, if it's what I think you're saying, then yeah, it's Rumi. It should be Rumi. Yeah, it is. I'm familiar with the quote.
Consciousness sleeps in minerals, streams in plants, wakes up in animals, becomes self-aware in humans.
Yeah, so there is talks about the different layers of soul as well, like mineral soul versus vegetative soul versus animal versus rational.
The Timaeus as well. The Timaeus seems similar to that. Different levels of consciousness. My students have heard me rant about the Rumi translations. So I learned from a Persian language teaching community that the most common Rumi translation in English is Coleman Banks, and how he's
Barks. Coleman Barks.
Coleman Barks, yeah. How he doesn't know Farsi and just rewrote, kind of made up most of the translation.
Oh wow.
Yeah,
So-
the most popular Rumi translations actually strip out a lot of the Islamic elements
Exactly,
from
on
it.
purpose, or the
It's really
Eastern
interesting.
elements.
Yeah. Oh yeah,
Just make it all American
they make it
Western,
sound so much
easy,
more
digestible
like
stuff.
they make it sound a lot more hippie and new agey than it actually is.
Yeah. And also, it kind of that really ruins the texture of it, what they're actually writing. Even if you don't want the religious reference, it just strips the reality from it. They're referencing something in particular for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's
Even
not
if-
respectful to the idea. Like if somebody wants to strip that on their own, they can, but like don't do it for them.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'll have to avoid that translation.
It's hard to.
Yeah,
I
it's
have
better
a-
to-
Unfortunately,
I have a
it's been
little-
scattered into so many quotes across memes on the internet.
I have a well, that website's called Learn Persian, I think, or I don't know. It's just one of those Twitter websites. They teach through poetry, which is fun. But a lot of their students end up translating Rumi like from like the original. That's one of their final lessons, and they post like those original translations. They're pretty interesting, to see, and they compare it with like the Barks version and stuff. It's interesting.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But yeah, the word trust there, or amanat, which is what it is in Arabic, that's kind of like the word that is used for. It's the rough equivalent of like what would be in Judeo Christianity, like the covenant to some extent, the covenant between man and God sort of thing.
Mhm.
That's in a sense what the trust
Mm.
is referring to there. That's why it's in
Interesting.
capital
That's
letters
cool.
there.
I saw a really interesting thread of on. I gotta find it. I lost it too. I didn't like it, and so it just like disappeared when my feed refreshed. On Twitter, it was of a history of Jewish teachers who saw Muhammad as a saint,
Interesting.
which is really cool. Yeah, like it was like a Jewish, like they thought Muhammad was awesome and his followers were awesome, but like they thought they just weren't speaking to us. It was a Gentile thing, a Gentile prophet, just not a Jewish prophet. Which is, I thought it was a cool long list of how they like kind of incorporated some of their thinking and like how their relationship to it. Like I gotta go find it again. I don't know where it is though.
Interesting.
But yeah, so yeah, because of the whole pre-existence of souls things and this whole thing about the covenant made prior, it actually changes. It allows for a lot of different metaphysics to come up for free will and reconciling free will with predetermination and things like that. There's a lot of interesting things that ends up coming out of this. Like so, like for example, the quote that I just put here, this kind of alludes a little bit to like this whole thing of free will, but then also determinism to some extent. This idea of returning free will back to, returning the trust back to God to some extent is sort of where you get into this, where things start to get, where you start to see how determinism sort of factors in to some extent, but not in the most blunt way that, where people just say, oh, determinism versus free will, but it's more complicated than that. There's a kind of weird continuum that takes place.
Well, the way I see it is if you're interacting with eternal God, then God's actions are, since God's actions are always like absolute from the timeless perspective beyond change, then you're actually, and like say God's acting in response to something you have done, that you're actually in a way changing all of time and eternity by proxy of God. If that makes sense. So he'll like change the ending of the story in a sense, like not change it in the way like it was something before, but like he'll make the ending a certain way of the story a certain way in response to something you have done. And or even the beginning. Like he'll set the beginning up in a certain way, and it's anticipation of something you will do.
I've gotten that hinted from Hart too. I'm
Yeah.
not sure what you're thinking about, or like this sense in Christian universalism that not only will like everything end well, but in the end the story will be remade. Like we'll be rewriting the story itself, the atrocities and evils. We're going through them now, but eventually we won't have. Like we're like undoing them as we're going through them. I don't know, something kind of to that effect.
Kind of sort of mind bending. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a sense in which,
like the multiverse theory.
What?
Like a multiverse theory where we're dropping off the bad universes into non-reality.
Yeah. The only thing for me is that like there's still a universe where it did happen, but at least the way to the extent that I can understand it right now, it seems to me like it's sort of like, I said I don't know if this got on the recording, but probably a couple weeks ago about like this metaphor of each person being filled from bottom to top, and we're only at the bottom, kind of starting position of our existence. There's a sense in which that which is experienced as privation and suffering and evil is just incomplete. And if you're only looking at that part of it, it is evil. But if you see the complete picture, it's goodness. So I think Augustine says something like this when he talks about like the painting needing to have some kind of shade or darkness in it. But if you look at the whole painting, it's beautiful. But if you're focusing on that one shadowy part, just all dark and foreboding.
I've never really liked that exactly because I don't know. I don't know how it works. I don't understand, but
it
gets
trippy at a certain point because
there's a great short story by Ursula Le Guin. You guys have to read if you haven't read it. It's called. You gotta know my stuff before I cite it. Oh my gosh, I forgot. I've tried to teach this story too a couple times, and I always forget the name. Basically, I'll tell you the story. So the story is that there is a beautiful city, a perfect utopia, and like every weekend there's a parade that goes to the city of frivolity and dancing, the most beautiful music you've ever seen, the greatest tapestries flying through the air, people having like wild and free sex and love and food and rejoicing everywhere through the city.
Yeah.
Oh, it's sorry. It's the coming of age ceremony. So it's these now they're adults, so they can engage in drinking and sex and all kinds of crazy fun stuff. And so they go and do that, right? And it's this perfect. And there's no death. There's no murder, no crime, no shortages, no nothing. It's just all you can dream, perfect heaven, right?
Yeah.
But when they turn 18 or whatever their adulthood is, right? When they come of age, after their party, they're led down into the basement of a dungeon, a long stairwell, and not even in the dungeon itself, but there's just this like water, like a closet, like a normal like broom closet, and with the brooms and with the buckets, they open a slot, and there's a child sitting in the dark in its own feces, just like sick and decaying. And they say to the adult, the new adult, "We can't explain it to you, but this child is why everything is perfect. So you have to live in this city knowing this child sits here in the dark, sick and distorted." And so then the adults choose whether to stay in that world or to leave it and go die outside of the perfect city. So that's my dramatic like depiction of how do we accept this world is made by a good God? That's it's the not the theocracy,
The Odyssey.
theodicy.
Theodicy.
Yeah, theodicy question.
Yeah, I mean, that's, part of what that's what we're addressing in different ways, I think.
Let me go find that story.
Yeah, for sure. Both what I was just talking about and also the preexistence of the soul, or at least the eternal agency of the soul to consent to this life of suffering. I think
Yeah, in a sense, like kind of. I mean, the way that it happens, that's why, like with my tradition, it's a really weird one where, like of course, like God is in one sense the creator of everything, but then when it comes to like the idea of like the direct or instrumental cause of the world is attributed actually to like the soul is really
And
what
that makes sense.
is and that's the reason why you have this thing of like why it seems like a like the perfect God doesn't make the world. That's because like the world is not made directly from the pure command. Like divine, like Christ is utterly complete. So the light of Christ, or the divine mind is perfect, static. It doesn't undergo any kind of change. But then when that divine mind, in a sense, through its beneficence, which it inherits from the Father, creates, then you have the soul, which is kind of like a child, right? Where it could potentially be Christ, but it starts out as a child. And so because of that, there is this imperfection or this defect. And then what you have is, or basically more like it's a potential, right? It's in a state of potential. And so then the physical world is basically what's going on in the mind of that soul trying to arrange itself and perfect itself. And so the idea is that the reason why it doesn't look like the world matches the perfection of the creator is because, in fact, first of all, the world emerges from a creator which is itself still in a state of potential, and also because creation doesn't refer simply to the moment in which the world comes to being, but creation is an unfolding act that continues until the actual final completion of the world, which is when it will finally look actualized and as if a great God made it, sort of thing. There's a sense in which human beings are the priests bringing down the kingdom into the world and actually making the world into the kingdom, starting with their own hearts, and then the overflowing emanation, right? So kind of just like how there, like God creates through this overabundance. There's this idea that when you create the kingdom of God within your heart, then there's an overabundance and emanation that comes through all your actions, your thoughts, your words, your deeds, whatever, and that causes its materialization in the external world as well. And so then that is in a sense the final end or telos or completion of the world, and that's when you'll actually is when you actually have what you call the Lord being established upon the throne, this final day of creation, because
I don't know,
until
Naveed.
then it's not evident.
Naveed, you tell me you're a Muslim, but I feel like you're more of a Christian than I am. We talk about this. So good job.
It's interesting. It's interesting you say that, because that's the interesting thing, right? Is that is exactly what an Ismaili would argue, is that we're the most Christian of the Christians.
Oh.
Like that's actually a quote. That's actually a quote that one of the Ismaili imams mentions, where because we're not really seeing, because remember, like the idea that this is all just like if you look at what Plato and so many people say, this is all a single. Like religion is not really a fragmented thing, right? It's a single God, a single reality, and so these distinctions have more to do with the way they manifest in our minds, right? Like, okay, this is my idea of what Christ looks like. So what the Imam is sort of implying is that, well, what we're doing is not Christianity, right? Like, we would just say that this is actually more Christian than what a lot of Christians are. That this is actually what Jesus was trying to tell you, sort of thing. So
Now,
that's
there
the
are a
thing.
lot
So
of
that's why
Christians
the
who say those things, but it's just not the,
Yeah.
it's not the, widely popularized. I mean, that's changing, but it's not something you typically hear.
yeah, and it's the same way where like a Christian would say, well, we're more Jewish than the Jews are to some extent,
Yeah.
right? Like there's this, like it all goes back
They wish,
because
but
there is a truth and yeah, there's a reality and an unreality to that, right? Like
Mhm.
Hmm.
it's the same idea to some extent. Is that like in the same sense that we're saying like, oh, Christianity is like the fulfillment of Judaism to some extent, like in the same sense, this is looking at it as well, this is the fulfillment of that, right? Like it's another unveiling as human beings progress, move forward, all of that sort of stuff, right? So that's what ends up making the synergy work. So, and of course, because I've always lived in a Western country, so I end up having all these Christian terms that are so familiar to me. That's why it ends up feeling very easy to just use some of the terminology.
Mhm.
Because funny enough, I probably knew more Christianity than I did about my own faith for the longest time.
Mhm,
It was
mhm.
like since that I've been looking, I've understood a lot of the terms that are in my own tradition because growing up there just wasn't a lot of um, good quality education. Like I had to find other mentors and people to help me navigate Islamic traditions. Um, so that's partly the reason why it's like that too, because like there are just times where it's just easy to grab the Christian term because I probably learned it first before I'd
Mhm.
even learned what the was in the tradition I grew up in. Oddly enough,
That makes
um,
sense. Yeah.
yeah, being bicultural is a very weird thing. A lot of
Mhm.
bizarre things happen.
So this question of the like an imperfect creator, or like this is one of the reasons why I asked Brian the other day, why like where does the Christian tradition peg the demiurge? Because the demiurge is also seen as kind of this little bit of an imperfect creator. That's why Plato in the Timaeus makes it the creator, because the true God that is being, obviously, since this world is corrupt or partial or part being, half being, even if we don't talk about a fall, right? The fact that it's in a state of movement um and change, it can't be the one being that's touching it. It has to be this sub being that's doing the dirty work. The dirty work being just working with matter, I guess, or working with
Yeah,
the non-perfect. Um,
and this is where pantheism comes from, right? This
mhm.
is exactly where this kind of reconciles with pantheism to some extent. Is that is that pantheism is on the right track to some extent? Like when it says, for example, like the universe, the creator and the universe are one to some extent, or like there's a sense in which like the universe is like God trying to discover himself. That's
Mhm.
literally what the demiurge story is. Is that you're actually seeing is that the demiurge is that this world is the playing out of its self-discovery and it's actualization, that process of complete becoming.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I was gonna say, we were talking about this, that yeah, I think we got to purge from our mind the presumption that the world as this is created um in this way by God, and that actually creation as we know it is a corrupt, fallen image of what it was supposed to be. made that way by creatures, whether you talk about angelic or human creatures. But it's kind of a reflexive sentiment. I mean, even just beyond some kind of tradition or something, because um, I think there's just this, we're meant to like automatically see God through creation. Like that was the whole intention. And so we have to actually adjust to the fact that it's not like that because it wasn't meant to be like this. So,
Well, not that it wasn't meant to be, but this is not the final state of things is really the idea. So it's going somewhere,
yeah,
right? The idea is
there's
that
two.
this is not like creation as an act hasn't actually completed yet. That's why it doesn't look right. Like to
Yeah,
say that God created the world is actually a misnomer because he's actually creating the world. Like that's one thing you'll notice in my particular tradition of Islam is that it actually says that the 7 days or the 7 days of creation thing is an unfolding event that we're seeing right now. It doesn't refer simply to the physical, Big Bang and things emerging and things coming down, and starting to have material form, but it's also talking about the chain of revelation. So it actually talks about, for example, like we'll say the 7 days of the week, they equate it to what are called like the seven speaker prophets. So it mentions that Sunday is Adam, the day of Adam, so the first age, right? Then it will say Monday is the cycle of Noah. Tuesday,
Abraham.
Yep.
These are the covenants.
Yeah. Wednesday, Moses. Thursday, Jesus. Okay, yeah.
I had a little cartoon growing up that taught me the different covenants God made. Didn't include Muhammad though. Ended with Jesus.
And then
I'm on the edge of my seat. Not literally, but wondering what Saturday is. The second okay.
The second, and in a sense, the hour, right? So like the point where you actually see the culmination of everything, and everything starts to make sense and become clear. So this is sort of how it's defined, is that like there's a layer of it that's of course referring to the physical manifestation of the world, but that this in parallel is also still unfolding within the human realm, like our human experience. And so we're still witnessing, the creation of the world, and that it will become very obvious, of the full goodness or God or the Lord, being established upon the throne or whatever, is something that you actually will notice at this point, not prior to this. This is where the world will actually perfectly reflect.
Yeah.
And actually be have the full descent of the kingdom.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I take your point about God's creating the world. So in a sense, it's not true to say that it wasn't meant to be this way. What I meant was it's not representing our teleological purpose because of the distortion of corruption. But that distortion and corruption is a factor in the context of a dynamic interplay between intelligent creatures and the creator, which exists in a space where there's still this potentiality because of the incomplete creation. So I think both views work together.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like evil is the result of the idea of unactualized potential. Good. It's the change. It's the messy stuff happening between the states of its inception and its final static.
Does change necessitate evil, or is it just creates the possibility of evil, right?
Well, no, it does actually, because remember, when we're saying evil, we don't necessarily have to mean like evil as in wahaha evil, right? Like by evil we mean privation, right? Like this idea of not having fully or not being fully. And so you could say in that sense, yes, it doesn't necessitate a particular evil, like as in it doesn't mean that, oh, so and so particular evil act that I commit had to happen. But evil in a very general sense is absolutely going to be the case because it's privation, right? Yeah.
So if we were all perfectly aligned with our souls, our second star, or with the revelation, then we'd be able to mitigate the least amount of evil or privation possible, from point A to point B, but we're not. So we dive further into it, maybe.
Well, I would say all evil is privation, but is all privation evil? because you could have potentiality for growth, and that doesn't necessarily, that wouldn't be the same thing as what we would call.
I think we're trying to using different evils
corruption.
here, because I think what Naveed said, it made sense to me with that. There's a sense of evil that, like privation is the cause of all particular or personal evil, but not all privation is personally evil, right? Like
Well,
my
not just
committing.
that, but no, go ahead, finish your, and then yeah.
That was pretty much it. But yeah, like just because, okay, so why am I committing X sin? It's because I lack something. Does that negate my responsibility to it? No, but I'm still not like the fact that I am the fact that I exist in a world of privation doesn't mean that. I'm kind of losing my words here. Actually, you go ahead. Lost my train
Yeah,
of
no,
thought.
and the other thing is we have to widen again. The point of me talking about privation is we have to also widen the sense of what we mean by evil. So we're not only talking about evil as in like willed evils by people, but evil even in the sense of suffering, right? Because people also, when they're talking about the theodicy, they also mean why do we suffer, right? So, for example, growing up, our development from being a child to an adult is painful, right? Like being a teenager and all that kind of stuff. There's a sense in which there's nothing evil about that. It's not evil to be a teenager and have angst and go through all that stuff, and yet it's suffering, right? Like change, that whole thing of change and potentiality, it may not be like every privation, like that privation is not an evil thing. Like you're not evil for being a teenager, but it comes with evils, right? Like you're afflicted by all the issues and things that come from that incompletion, right? There's a suffering that goes along with having to go through that phase of development and change and uncertainty, right? Growth. So that's also what would be considered an evil to some extent.
True, but my friend, Matthew, he has made a distinction between two different types of suffering, in that there's a type of suffering where you're anticipating the completion or the good result, sort of like when you're suffering when you're exercising, like it hurts, so it's painful, but you're doing it for a purpose, and it's breaking down your muscles so that they can be built up later. But there's a kind of suffering, and maybe this is more just has to do with the disposition that you have in the midst of suffering, right? But there's a certain kind of suffering or disposition where you're just kind of messed up and you're broken, and you just like you're undercutting yourself, you're undermining yourself, you're hating yourself, you're destroying your own potentiality and all that kind of thing. So that some type, like the first kind of suffering, that's needed in this trajectory from a state of potential to a state of actualization. But then the second kind of suffering is not necessary. It's something that can happen when you lose sight of the goal or the overall,
it's basically it's still privation, but you're going in the wrong direction. So because you don't have to evolve, you can devolve too, right? There's a sense that you can shred or fragment yourself further rather than moving towards unity, right? So so there is that. There is also you can go in the reverse, right? So change can also be disintegration. That takes place, and so those are what you would call they would be called unnecessary in the sense that there's nothing that compels us to have to do that, but then the part in which it becomes necessary is more so that, well, because of the fact that human beings can go here and there or can and have certain volitions, whatever, it ends up being inevitable that it's going to happen. But it would also not be considered necessary in the same way that some of those other things are. Like, for example, like the sort of things that are in anticipation of the fulfillment of telos, right?
It's sort of like they're psychologically necessary because you had to have that freedom and that personal growth to overcome that sort of disposition. In a sense, it was a psychologically necessary step. Even though you were degenerating, you had to be free to degenerate and get to the bottom of the barrel, and then realize, oh, I needed a different path. Like the prodigal son. The prodigal son had to be free to leave.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
so
because love is only freely given, right? If we're talking
Right.
about love, it's like God is love, and it's all about love. Love is a free act, right?
yeah.
Like without free will, human beings would never actually love God ever.
Mm-hmm.
To some extent, there's a sense in which it would be impossible to love.
Yeah.
We're only able to love him because we're able to then distinguish or make other things the object of our love and be let down by it,
Mm-hmm.
right? To the point where eventually you realize God is the only stable object of love.
Yeah.
Right. That's really the idea, and that's to say that that's the paper I wrote. It goes over that whole thing. So if anybody wanted to look at that, but because that basically that's how I end up ending it, is talking about the whole love thing. And
Did you link that before? Oh yeah, you linked. It was a video, wasn't it? I need to
yeah, I
actually
have a
watch
video
that.
version, but then here's also I think I put the article version too, but I'll just repost it again.
Okay.
But yeah, I have a video version where I just basically just give a 20-minute, sort of conference
Okay.
summary of it.
Yeah.
But then like the actual details, the quotations and stuff, like that's in the, in the file here.
Okay. Cool.
But basically, but I end up, going through that entire system and how, in a sense, like I'm basically arguing that, that this Bible story is actually encoding that entire process of creation, human journey, and all that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So like, so it's cool. It's one of those. It's just there's a lot of things that start to make a lot more sense when you actually because here's the thing, right? Like this is where. So this is the tension, right? Like we talk about, for example, this idea that, like, for example, a lot of people would probably say, so like that what I'm talking about is very hard to square away biblically, like if you took the Bible in isolation or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Which is fine. So people will say, well, you have to have scriptural support, or like if you look at scholasticism, the idea is that reason serves scripture. But of course, this entails still an understanding of what scripture is, right? And like this assumes that there's a static idea of scripture, or a static reading of scripture, or static understanding of what the nature of scripture and its parables and things are. And what the relationship of that is to the intellectual discoveries we make as human beings individually.
Yeah.
But that whole thing of, is something biblically supported, can become a lot murkier if with a different interpretation of what the Bible actually is, or what scripture is actually supposed to represent, right? Like when we were talking about like when Matthew was here the other time, we were talking about scripture as being actually like this sort of like attempting to make the experience of realization into a static thing to some extent. Like it's kind of an expression of the outpouring or the understanding or like the contact of, or the realization of of Christ, or and then those who witness Christ or whatever. When you look at it in that particular sense, it becomes a different sort of thing, right? Like because the problem is we end up looking at it as like a narrative book, or similar to other sorts of texts or things that we're looking at. And that's a genre error to some extent. So there's a lot of, it really comes down to sort of what there's a sense in which the way that I've interpreted it would be very far-fetched and a lot of Christians wouldn't like it, but then there's another sense in which it works.
Something
if you look
the whole religious world, Muslims and Christians and everyone else in between, all need to recover, is just this wider thing of what it means to read. We don't want to read. That's the problem. We don't want to read it. We want to like see it as like a rule book or something else.
But it's also hard. That's why too, right? I mean, it's not easy, and people have different capacities for it. Some people have to work harder to do it, some less so.
There's
some things in the middle. Yeah.
the
And then, of course,
Christian
like in our current
thinker.
world, we're making it more difficult for ourselves with the societies that we made, where even if people want to give the time, they can't because they're trapped in all kinds of other stuff that they have to
Survive
give
with,
them
yeah.
to. Yeah, which arguably even medieval peasants didn't have to worry about to some extent.
Yeah, that's
Um,
true.
It's nuts. Yeah, like it's really funny how we're in some senses like less free than even some of the most impoverished people of older periods.
Yeah.
Getting tired. Keep forgetting things. What did I just say?
Oh.
About reading. I don't know. I'll remember in a second.
I forgot things I wanted to say too, I think, but they weren't that important.
You can go ahead.
No, I think I just lost track. But yeah, I mean, do we want to discuss a little more about Aristotle and then
Yeah, I know we
call it a day?
We enjoy our tangents quite a bit, don't we?
Yeah, I know. Because I was thinking maybe we might consider going a little more on Aristotle next week if we can get more people.
Yeah.
Because we haven't even read all of it. I mean, Navi, I think you probably read all of it, but
most of it. I didn't read the sixth part of it, but I got the first 5. Yeah.
Yeah, we can probably do another week on Aristotle just from necessity. After the fact, it's fine.
Yeah.
And I mean, a lot of us are regulars. Like at least us 3 are here every time. So I feel like even if we need to extend it out, like take another day for Aristotle, it's fine because it looks like everyone's able to show up, or at least like a few of us, like a core 3 or 4 people, are able to show up pretty consistently.
Yeah.
It's nice to see other faces too, though, or even new faces. It's always good.
Yeah.
I have a student of mine who says he wants to join next week.
Cool.
Your ex-student, he's a post. He's looking for colleges, post senior.
Nice. Yeah, and the thing is, even though the Aristotle section is not very long, there's actually a lot to unpack. So it actually makes sense.
Those last 2 sections of Plato, you realize you're entering different territory. You're like, oh,
yeah,
this world of forms just got a lot thicker real fast.
Yeah.
Because I loved how clear the beginning of Plato was. They made a lot of like concepts for me, like click that I had read but didn't understand yet. But yeah, the whole receptacle and like movement but not movement and different terms and stuff. You're like, oh, hello.
That was intense.
Yeah. So it's pretty.
Yeah.
He restates the stuff a lot. Like he does a good like. Sometimes I find it annoying, but also it's helpful just for learning this stuff. Is he like? I feel like in one section he says the same thing like each paragraph in a way. Like he kind of like re-says it with one additional thing, re-says it again with one additional thing.
Yeah.
He kind of like.
Yeah, I like it actually. It makes it easier to follow. Yeah.
He kind of drives it into you. But I underline like key points right in my book. I end up underlining like the same sentence like over like 4 different pages because like I'm like, oh, this is the important part. Wait, that was also the important. It's the same section, so it's like the important part in the previous paragraph as well. Yeah.
That's funny. Well, it's a good way to build argument because you can make the point in different ways. Makes it harder if you can keep being consistent like that and referring to different arguments but then making the same point. I haven't had time to read all the quotes in here, so I'm going to have to go back.
Yeah, this ties very well into the Aristotle chapter because this one has a direct reference to like Nasser Khusro in this quote that I just put. He basically directly is referencing what the 5 causes that lead to anything coming into being, according to Aristotle.
5? I knew of 4.
Oh yeah, so it is 4, but yeah, you're right. It is 4, but Nasser Khusro ends up breaking one of them into 2 separate ones in this case.
Oh.
oddly enough. So it's still the same model, but it has to do with the way that he phrases it. So he ends up talking
Okay.
about 5 things, but you're right that Aristotle's thing is formulated in 4.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because he doesn't mention Aristotle by name, but he basically refers to him as like he says like the according to the master of logic is what he says, and he knows people will get who that is basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's kind of he mentions that like according to the the master of logic such and such is the case, and so then he uses that thing as to argue sort of for the telos of the world here and how like human beings are the ultimate purpose for creation.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Can you hear yelling outside?
Nope.
Okay, good. Because I'm hearing like a lot of people yelling outside. It's kind of distracting. Okay. The cause for the throne on which the Sultan is to sit is construction of the carpenter of his tools. All out of wood, all come about through the command of the king who wishes to sit upon the throne. Okay, yeah. So the last to be constructed must be the first cause. That construction for this reason, the sages recite the well-known matter first in thought. Last indeed, do you not? This is interesting. Do you not you see that the carpenter's first thought must be that the king should have a throne, that his final thought must be that the king sits upon the throne. The why of the world is, in the end, the creation of man, after whom nothing else came to be. At the beginning of creation, it is said, the creator of the world had the creation of man as his aim, so that man might come to be at the end of his creation. Wow. Pretty profound.
That's that reminds me of the whole concept of the earth being made with the incarnation, like Christ being this like cross, this center point. He's the first and last man of the new set, you know.
That's what I love about like my faith, that they have a lot of they make a lot of emphasis on, like with the with Christ incarnation as a baby in swaddling clothes in a cave, and then at the end after his crucifixion being wrapped in burial clothes in a tomb, basically a cave. And they have an icon where the nativity is just showing him as a baby, no one else, and then like him buried just above that, and it's like the same cave, but just like I think it was like a cave within a cave or something like that. But like, there's a prayer also the priest prays where he says, as you were incarnated, as you were on the cross, as you were buried, as you rose again, you were also seated in majesty eternally, and at the very same time. So I love that, because that's kind of how I've always seen it.
The cross is Christ's enthronement.
Yeah.
The cross is the right hand of God.
Yeah.
His lowest moment is his highest.
Mm-hmm. The inside is the outside, the low is the high, that almost sounds like Parmenides right there.
I have a icon of the Andrei Rublev Trinity icon on my altar, and there's a so the Trinity icon is those 3 strangers who meet Abraham, right, in Genesis, and they warn him of Lot's, the Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot's to save Lot. Well, and they represent the Trinity in the Greek Orthodox tradition. But they're conversing over the table, right, which represents the world and also the sacrificial of the Eucharist and things like that. But there's this big hillside right behind Jesus, or like the angel associated with Jesus, and it's Golgotha.
Yeah.
Like sitting right here, like he's like discussing, like I don't know, just like this like moment, like he's discussing the world or whatever God's discussing, and just like Golgotha is like standing behind him. And then I think behind the Father is Abraham's like house, which is like a kingdom, or Zion. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. And it's what's interesting too is in the icons I've seen, they look both masculine and feminine.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, I agree with that. There's actually I've seen a kind of feminist version of the icon where they're like all women, and there's like a black woman and an Asian woman and a white woman, and I think that's fine. Like, it's great to see God in yourself, no matter who it is. But this kind of that genderless ambivalence of angels kind of worked already.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
You know, like, you didn't need to.
it contains everyone.
Yeah. Of course, they're everyone. You know, that's kind of the point.
Yeah. Oh, let's see. This is something else. Oh wait. Oh, that's a different message. Okay. Similarity to not.
I keep thinking of different things. Like, these are such, like, Plato and Aristotle. That's why you have so great tangents. Is that Plato and Aristotle? We're talking about like the most basic form of reality, and so we keep like connecting that to like everything.
Yeah.
Our tangents are just everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking, again, it keeps related to the fall again, because we keep thinking about, like, because Plato and Aristotle keep talking in these terms of the perfect, of the good, of how the mind and world works, but we keep getting confronted with how not good the mind and the world works and everything like that. So one part of Aristotle is how the telos, or the what is the formal cause, and the for the sake of which the final cause are one, right? So it is what it will be, or it is what it needs to be. That kind of concept.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Then my mind immediately jumps to the fall, the theodicy, with that question, with that concept.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, it changes your idea of what that means. Yeah. It takes away that whole idea of error, right? Or in the sense of, and all of that. Because the idea of telos makes this whole perfection thing a bit more relative, right? That the perfection of different things is based on its own telos, right? So there's a sense in which there is a kind of universal telos where all of those are interacting towards something. But then at the individual level, that manifests in so many different ways. And so the perfection of one form of life or one being is not the same as the perfection of another, in another sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Which is a lot psychologically just a lot friendlier and kinder in many ways when you look at it that way. It's a very merciful thing. Because then you're not completely bound to looking at yourself as just your journey is compared to a particular saint or or prophet, because they're different, the roles are different.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, let me look at this a little bit. Oh, my neck is killing me. I'm breaking in this new bed, and I think it's just making me ache a bit. Also, I don't think my body has been able to relax as much as it has now. And I remember it was saying, like, if you were like, if your muscles were still relaxing more, they settle in more, and then they like can ache more when you work them, or something like that. I don't know if that's true, but it seems like it feels like it's just happening. Just getting a lot of neck aches the last couple of days. Yeah, it'll be okay though. I've gone through that before. Probably need to go back to the chiropractor. Intelligible in general, intelligible being as a whole. Okay, so
We're talking about matter quite a bit. So nature as the cause of motion. Nature is a certain principle and cause of being in motion and being at rest, in that which it belongs primarily according to itself. I was a little confused. Obviously, an unmoving mover is confusing. Moving and not moving at the same time. Or like,
Mhm.
so is it moving in? Obviously, I know it's analogy or a metaphor, but is it moving in stasis, or is there two different parts, a moving part and a non-moving part, or both?
Yeah. So it looks like, so remember, when he's talking about motion, he's talking about activity, right? Because he
Mhm.
says that activity is also kind of like he's talking about energies, motion, activity, that these are all actually tied to what form is. That
Mhm.
they're like, these are all different ways in which form manifests, in a sense. The different modes of form to some extent. So it looks like when he talks about this whole idea of the unmoved mover, is that like there's a sense in which there is a motion, but it has to do with whether the motion is relative to something or whether it's completely independent, right? So he gives an example of like something that moves in respect to something else, meaning like planets that revolve around the sun, right? But then there's also the idea where the planets also just rotate, right? On their own axes, where it's like a self-contained motion, right? It's not a motion relative to anything else or necessarily caused by something else, but it's a self-contained, self-caused type of motion that's inward directed to some extent. And that's sort of what he ends up saying about the unmoved mover, is that the unmoved mover is unmoved relative to other things, but it does have a motion of its own. Like there is a sense in which it is moving, or has activity and is active, um, because it's not inert. Like it doesn't have like it's not something that just doesn't do anything or doesn't think anything or whatever, but rather it's like this a very pure motion is what he sort of calls it. Like it's a like the active intellect is basically thinking is merged with the content with which it thinks, and so it has no need to contemplate or direct outward any of its
Thinking
activity.
being the name of the book.
Yeah, so it's
Yeah.
static relative to other moving things, but it moves in its own way. But it would be static in comparison to like the way other things are in motion. You know what I mean? Like its motion is of a different
Mhm.
nature, is the idea to some extent.
You know, it's funny that someone several years back tried to tell me that Aristotle could be interpreted as an atheist because his unmoved mover is just like some inert reality or something like that, and I'm like, I don't think so.
No,
No,
Perl does a good job arguing why that's crap. He
yeah,
does a pretty good job when he talks about what goes deeper into what this unmoved
Mhm.
mover is. He's like, nope, it's an intelligence, and it very
Mhm.
much, and he calls it basically the most, like, it's funny because they're saying inert, but he literally says that is it is the most lively of living things. Like it's like he literally says it's the complete opposite, that it's actually far more alive than
Nice.
other living things in so many ways. Like its activity is a certain perfect life uh or emotion, which is simply just it's just not it has no need to be um externally directed is the difference. So it's got a life that doesn't involve like this idea of the pursuit of anything or needing to go somewhere or attain something it doesn't have, be
Right,
somewhere that it isn't already. Like in that sense, it looks inert, right?
but
Because it
that
doesn't do all those
enables,
sorts of things. Yeah.
it to be more active, or more completely active, because it's more complete in its motion
This reminds me of
than something
Like
that is
plants, right?
able to be acted
Just like
upon.
plants relative to us. It's just like
Yeah.
This reminds
plants.
me of the term. It's really common in especially social Trinitarian theory.
Perichoresis?
Perichoresis. Yeah,
Yeah,
perichoresis. Self-contained
Yeah.
movement inside.
yeah,
Yeah, because plants are a good example of something that in one sense has a life that is like like that's less dependent, less contingent, right? It doesn't have to go anywhere. It doesn't have to worry about acquisition, like from of course there's still some, right? It's getting these from the soil, but relative to animals, its motion is it's almost still, right? Like plants just look like these
Mhm.
still unmoving things, but really we know plants are very, very, very alive and very active, right? That's the funny
Yeah.
thing, right? Like there's
Yeah.
this incredible activity, but we would say, oddly enough, just from appearances, that it is inactive or inert, right? Like they look inert to us.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not. They're filled with activity, and it's a kind of activity that is just more self-contained in so many ways.
Mhm.
Oh, I just want to say real quick that in the midst of all discussion about forms and motion and stuff, I've been reading this book called Place of the Lion by Charles Williams. He was one of the Inklings.
Mhm.
And I've been wanting to read it for quite a while, but I finally was able to get the audiobook. Just actually was made pretty recently. And basically what it is like the eternal forms appear in our manifest reality. Like there's, it's called the Place of the Lion because there's the form of the lion, and all, like for instance, like there's also the form of the butterfly, and all these butterflies come and are absorbed by it into this form of the butterfly, and it's kind of an amusing and fun novel, and kind of profound at certain points because he gets philosophical in the middle of writing, and I think it actually inspired C.S. Lewis a bit. I think the lion might have been inspiration for Aslan. After reading it, I haven't quite finished it, but I'm almost done. But yeah, C.S. Lewis really loved that book. So anyway, I just thought that would be fun, a fun little side note, in case anyone would like to read something like that.
Yeah, I have multiple Owen Barfield on my shelf. Barfield.
Oh,
He's got
yeah. Owen Barfield, you said?
Mhm. I
Yeah,
got two
okay. I
books.
haven't read anything by him yet, but I know C.S. Lewis
It's
liked him
actually
too.
one of my ideas for our next book. This is Idolatry of Appearances, because his whole thing is a relation of this kind of classical world to science, and that was a big topic in our discussion so far. So it might be interesting. He's critiquing kind of the industrial world, the nominalistic world. It's almost like a little mini. I would say it's like an almost mini City of God, kind of in his time frame. Talking about the idols of his age. So I don't know, might be relevant to our discussions.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And he wrote a whole like poetics, like a philosophy of poetry, which I also need to read. I haven't read that
That's
yet. Yeah,
cool.
it's a philosophy of poetry, of like linguistic and poetry, but it turns into a theory of symbols and meaning and stuff, which is really quickly in language, which is obviously all fascinating stuff.
Very cool.
Yeah. So, do you think Aristotle? I'm like throwing in a very different idea here that Perl hasn't mentioned yet. But do you think Aristotle believes in simplicity of being, perfect simplicity of being, or not? Because typically people who disagree with simplicity of being kind of reference Aristotle and his parts and his moving parts a little bit at some point, I think. I'm using very big, wide cuts here, obviously.
Again, it sort of depends. As far, yeah, because again, he does mention, for example, see, basically it comes down to whether, like, see, for Aristotle, for example, you could say that his unmoved mover is not utterly simple. Because like in most cosmologies, Neoplatonic cosmologies, the Aristotle's unmoved mover would actually be what you call the first creation, as opposed to the one.
Interesting.
But because remember, he identifies it as intellect, right? Pure intellect or pure idea. That wouldn't be considered what what you call like the first before everything in a sense. So it kind of depends, right? So but if you subscribe to the idea of something, like if you follow this whole thing of how, because remember the logic of it is there in Pearl basically, because he's talking about the idea that, like, for example, like he shows how Aristotle dismisses the idea that the combination of form and matter is like the most, like, remember he says there are three possible things that could be real, right? So the form of a thing, the matter of the thing, or the combination of its form and its matter. And so like he dismisses all of that, which is in a sense the truly real aspect. So what partly that implies, and he says that, like, for example, he dismisses the form matter combination because he says, for example, it's composite, right? Like composite things imply a prior reality to them, right?
Mhm.
Anything that is composed implies the pre-existence of its parts, right? So
Mhm.
if you keep following that logic back, you do end up with something that's actually about utter simplicity, because you're talking about something completely partless, right?
Mhm.
So that's in a sense what it means by simplicity, right? So there's people also, because simplicity can be kind of weird for people too, where we're thinking of simplicity as like a low thing, but this is a sense in which like basically this is a concept where something isn't just always too complex to be understood, but things can be too simple to be understood in a weird
Mhm.
way as well, right? This idea, just kind of like how so many of the concepts, right? Like how we're talking about, like Plato highlights this, right? We talk about justice, love, and things all day, and we do have a sense in which we know what they are. But if we sit there and ask what they are, we have issues, right? Like we clearly know something about it, which is why we're able to create systems and we're even able to talk about it as a common topic, and we're all like, oh yeah, that's just, or that's fair, or yeah, that's a very loving thing to do, or yeah, that's how you show your love to somebody or whatever, and they'd be like, oh yeah, that was great. But then talking about them is weird, right? And it's not really because of complexity, but
Mhm.
because it's actually something that's just so infrared actually rather than ultraviolet, right? Like it's so underlying, right?
It
It's
shows
so
limits to our
fundamental.
language as well.
Yeah,
Well,
it's like, yeah,
But
it's getting to more fundamental levels, right? So that's the kind
Yeah.
of simplicity
it's kind of like
that is being
asking.
talked about.
It's like
It's purity.
what's really different? What's the difference between one and infinity? One thing and infinite things. Because if you look at infinite things, it is one infinite, one infinity versus a singular object. It, the parts quickly become the whole, I guess. If you depends how you look at it.
Oh yeah. So like divine simplicity is also it's purity. It's purity of essence. And well, I mean, it's essence and existence. It's essence is its existence is how it's put into Thomistic language. But it's utter purity, and we're so compartmentalized. We need to be integrated in order to really understand more of that. And that's the problem. Like our idea of justice is compartmentalized from our idea of love and idea of mercy. Whereas even in the scripture, justice is seen as mercy, and mercy is seen as love, and love is seen as faithfulness. Faithfulness is seen as all these other qualities are actually convertible with each other. And then if you look at it through this philosophical lens, they must be convertible with each other. But that means that each of those essences are deeper and purer than what we think of them as. So this is how you get people like you say, like, well, God is just, but He's also love. I mean, or God is love, but He's also just, is how they'll say it. And it's like as if there are two different parts. Like God is, well, sometimes He's kind of kind and everything, but the other times He has to be rough, and He has to reconcile those two aspects of His nature, and that's why we have the cross. And it's like, no, this is all heresy. this is not the right way to think about it. Like, people are too compartmentalized in their thinking, and see these things as separate things when they're really one pure essence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, definitely.
And it,
And I mean, just looking at if you when you want, one thing that I kind of talk to some of like the little kid students I teach sometimes is like, if you want to understand how simplicity is powerful, like just look at where technology is going, right? Like there was a time in where if you look at like some of the older inventions, like old computers or certain things like that,
Mm-hmm.
look at how concrete and physical those computers are compared to the ones we have now, right? There's a sense in which what's going on in the computers or our phones is complicated, right? Like we're like, but so much of it is invisible. It's become non-concrete, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
there like so many of the same processes are happening, but in a way that is not apparent from looking at the components, right? There's a sense in which even though those other computers were huge, complicated, they were also simpler because you could see exactly what's happening, right? Like you can see the transistors and you can see this is leading to this and this is going like this. There's almost a sense in which the complexity makes it more intelligible in a material sort of sense.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas like with computers now, so much of it is weird and amorphous, but the thing is it's also simpler, right? Like there's a sense in which the simplicity is what makes it so baffling. It's how the
Yeah.
heck are all those same processes happening in something this large that used to happen in something that needed an entire room, and also happening faster and more powerfully than it did in that larger structure.
Yeah.
What? You know what I'm trying to say? Like
Mm-hmm.
so much
It
of that
also
is
like,
happening in a different sphere, yeah, or a different dimension.
and also, you know, cosmologists try to get to a simple equation that explains everything. Like, if you have an explanation, everything has to contain the logic and, you know, the explanatory basis and within itself. And if you have an explanation that has that in different parts, there has to be an explanation for all those parts. So there's this tendency to go back and, you know, further and further to the point of simplicity as well, because an explanation, the ultimate explanation, demands more simplicity. So this is not only true in natural theology and philosophy and all that; it's true in cosmology as well, of course, because, you know, those two are related. And I also wanted to add something, you know, as an explanation for those listening, or even you guys, if, you know, this helps. Part of the reason why, even before I knew what the term divine simplicity meant, that I started was trending in that direction is because I was thinking thoughts like, you know, why does God, you know, institute justice except to love us? Because, you know, he's actually doing something for us. He's not doing something just because he's personally offended. He's trying to set things right, but it's because, you know, he's setting things right. And in the biblical concept, setting things right, setting things back to how they should be, is justice, right? And in the classical sense,
Everything in its right place, yeah.
Yeah. So, and that is love. So, but I mean, like, unfortunately, in the modern sense, it's become distorted into this concept of like, well, just exacting a penal code, no matter how much suffering it might result in the person who's guilty, and just laying down the law and all that. And that's not really the original notion. I mean, that can be involved, but it has to be in this context of where things are being made right again, and that ultimately will result in reconciliation, and that's what a lot of the early church fathers were talking about too.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. So if no one else has anything to add about that, what you were saying, Naveed, about Aristotle, talking about disagreement with Plato, he does say, Perl does say here, similarly, let's see, or should I go back even further? Oh, yeah, let me just read this whole paragraph, actually. Aristotle's arguments against the... Huh? Oh, this is page 86.
Okay.
Aristotle's arguments against the supposedly Platonic ideas, then, are best understood not as a repudiation of the fundamentals of Plato's metaphysics of being as form, but rather as a rejection of the two-world Platonism, which, as we have seen, was never Plato's. Now, that's interesting because was he...
Yeah, that's what confused me, right? Because this is implying that he's refuting something that he believed was Plato's, but wasn't. But why would Aristotle have been mistaken about that?
I don't know. Well, let me read.
Considering he was a direct student, right? That's the weird part.
The conclusion he draws from such arguments is, it is clear that there are not forms of sensible things in the way in which some say. Thus, for example, the paradigms that Aristotle rejects are paradigms understood as models of which sensible things are copies, rather than as the very intelligible patterns of sensible things. And Aristotle himself occasionally refers to forms as paradigms in the latter sense. I'm trying to make sense of this. I'm just going to read. Similarly, Aristotle argues that if forms are separate, then they cannot be the reality of things, and conversely, that if they are the reality of things, then they cannot be separate. But for Plato, forms, just as the reality of things, are separate, not in the sense criticized by Aristotle of being another set of things reduplicating the sensible, but rather in that as intelligible identities they are distinct from, and qua conditioning, rather than a conditioned, are ontologically prior to the sensible things whose identities they are, a position to which Aristotle has no objection, and which, as we are now seeing, he indeed endorses. Aristotle's identification of reality as form is thus more authentically Platonic than the two-world Platonism that he rejects. Interesting.
Yeah.
And
so you see how, like, I'm saying the argument makes total sense.
Yeah.
And yet what I can't square away is why would Aristotle not know that, right? Because it's one thing if Aristotle was, for example, reading Plato like hundreds of years later or something. It could make sense, right? Because even if you're smart, a text is limited, right? Because you don't have access to the person himself or whatever.
Yeah.
But like Aristotle had access to Plato directly.
Is he refuting maybe some other students of Plato instead of Plato himself?
But that's the thing. But he doesn't say that, right? Like if you look at some of the phrases that he mentions in the, like for example, like that phrase that's very famous, like, oh, like Plato is dear to me, but dear to me is the truth or whatever. Like he literally says Plato, right? Like he says, I love Plato, but I like the truth, but I love the truth more still, right? In a sense, this idea that, well, yeah, okay, he's cool and all, but like there's just a situation where truth requires that I disagree with Plato here. So he doesn't even say like, oh, students are Platonists. He actually says mentions Plato by name in places and says, I don't agree with him. And that's why it's bizarre, right? Because it's like, how does a contemporary of Plato, who was at the academy, like in the academy, literally, how would he have had such a unusual idea about the forms and then reject that idea when it really wasn't Plato's idea in the first place? That's what baffles me. Was no one there to tell him that wasn't what Plato
I've
was
heard
saying?
of,
Like,
I don't know, I'm kind of out on a limb right now, but I've heard of an early Plato and a later Plato. Some scholars divide his works into different periods of thought. So maybe he's reacting to one aspect of Plato. I don't know. As I said, it's a limb.
no, I get that too, but remember that's a categorization that didn't exist then, right? Like they didn't look at the Platonic works that way. Right? Like the Neoplatonists and even people in the academy, they didn't see the work as development.
Yeah.
Like that's a really weird hypothesis, and like even you'll see that in a lot of like a lot of more recent scholarship is actually really skeptical about that whole early, like like the early dialogues, the middle dialogues, and doing like looking at the whole thing of development. Like in fact, there's one really good author. I haven't read all his work, but I'll put an article because he actually has a whole book series on this. But this is like a small like article summary of sort of what he tries to explain in those books. But there's this guy named William Altman, and he's one of these. He's another scholar who sort of he's trying to argue that you have to that the reason why we end up having this early versus late versus middle issue is that we're not understanding what Plato's dialogues are meant to be and how they're meant to be pedagogical material, instructing material, going from basics to and asking certain questions, answering them later. Like it only like if you're looking at the dialogues as his own development, it's flawed because we're failing to understand why he wrote the dialogues in the first place.
Yeah.
Like what were the dialogues used for? And when we look at what they were actually used for, it makes perfect sense that they would be this appearance of development or movement or change because he's starting from certain groundwork, from certain things, and then fleshing them out, like bringing up all kinds of contradictions, like, well, doesn't this raise this question though? And then he doesn't answer that there. But that doesn't mean he didn't know the answer, right? But the idea is that look to the later dialogue that comes next in the series, and then we'll explore it further, and then you'll start to see, oh, okay, like this is how it's reconciled. So that's part of the issue with it, and that's definitely what the Neoplatonists would do, right? Like if you look at their whole thing of the reading order of the dialogues, so they actually had what you call reading order, right?
Like
like
canon.
they would tell you that exactly there was a canonical way of reading. And I've been trying to follow William Altman's because he actually constructs his own version of a reading order, sort of based on the Neoplatonists, but then also something based on what he thinks is somewhat better of an idea. And it's really interesting. Like this is one sec. This is the article there, the reading order of Plato. So he basically talks about what are like the broad themes, why he also uses this whole thing of like developmental thing to also rehabilitate some of the Platonic dialogues that are considered not Plato or like that are considered spurious possibly, or just like pseudo Platonic whatever. Because there's some where he talks about the logic that where some of them were dismissed as that, oh, they were way too simplistic, or they seem to like they just don't match the complexity of some of these other ones, and they seem to make him seem a lot dumber or way too early in a certain development, and it doesn't make sense considering how many years happens between when he wrote this and wrote that. And so when you start looking at it as a pedagogical instrument, then it makes a lot more sense, and you realize, oh, okay. And then so then the argument for certain dialogues being fake is no longer that strong. So he talks about that as well.
Yeah, it makes it really reads that way to me too. When you just read it, because it's like in the tradition of Socrates, because the Socratic dialogue, he's leading people through
I guess I think I remember hearing that too. Was that like, and Perl says at the beginning too, is like it's hard to differentiate since Plato is writing kind of fiction, kind of not, right? It's a setup of Socrates that we don't know if it's actually really Socrates' words or just Plato speaking through the character of Socrates.
True.
And so we don't know how close the dialogue is to what Plato's actually thinking, or is he leading us to a thought process that'll get us to where he wants us to get, like point A could be completely against what Plato actually thinks, but it's where we need to get through to get where he wants us to go, get to point Z.
Yeah. Mythologically real.
It's real in another dimension. Yeah. So it's like, it's not about the events having happened the way he said they did, but the point is actually the content. You see what I'm like? That's what people argue about what a lot of the scriptural parables are doing. We're making a big mistake when we try to just look at them as history chronicles, but they're actually something in between. history and being fictional, because the idea is
Based on
that
a true story.
there's a sense in which events happened, but maybe not exactly that way. So, for example, the fact that Socrates was going around arguing, having these conversations, is true to some extent, right? Like this is true in that it's telling the story of something that happened, but it's not necessary that they happened exactly that way. You see what I'm saying? Or like that there were certain perfect conversations that happened where like, oh, like, you know, because if you think about that, there are some people where they talk about like what like the people in those dialogues seem so like a little stupid, where like there's some objections they don't raise they easily could have raised or whatever, because again, like that's true, right? Like it's not, because the point is there wasn't a discussion that really happened that way, but it's more that there was an amalgamation of things, right? So Socrates may have talked to a whole bunch of people, and then what that speaker or interlocutor is representing is kind of a culmination, right? Like kind of like what ends up being sort of the perfect way that this conversation could have went if it happened in one instance. What would it look like, and what's the logic, and in a sense. So like there's a way in which it's kind of it's a weird meta history, is in a sense. You see what I'm saying? Like it's not that the event happened, but it happened it's representational of a real event, or events, multiple events, or something like that.
Like I said in the chat, based on a true story.
So it's Plato's fan fiction of what happened, right?
I've considered
well,
this
sort of, right?
the-
but even based on a true story, like, is still different, right? Because based on a true story is still like basically just trying to go with events and maybe just, but this is still different from that too, though, right? Because it's also not based on, right? Like it's not based on in the sense that it's possible that none of those conversations ever actually happened that way. You see what I'm trying to say? Like,
yeah.
Like it wasn't a one person. Yeah, but it's a way in which it's packaging history differently.
No, I get you. Yeah.
For the purpose of instruction. It's completely, you know what I mean? Like it's trying to tell history without telling history, oddly enough.
Yeah,
Like
okay.
Yeah. Because what it's
you.
trying to do is give you the essence of the history, like why the history matters to us, as opposed to this is a retelling of the history that happened. Like this conversation happened, then he did this, and this is exactly what he said, and this guy responded exactly in this exact way.
I think
Like,
something similar
that's not what's going on.
probably is likely happening in the book of Job, where, you know, imagining them all sitting down and having these elaborate golden tongue speeches, like all on the spot, that's not that likely.
No.
And that they, I mean, I'm sure, like, if they were really wealthy, maybe they had scribes that were sitting there writing it, but it's really doubtful that this all happened exactly the way it's written down. And it is pedagogical as well.
Not the earliest book of the Bible either.
Yeah.
There's so much on biblical stuff I do not understand yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, gentlemen,
that's exactly the case.
Ooh, you guys are losing me. I'm fading here.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, I have other things to do.
But it's been good. It's a good intro to Aristotle, I think. Some of his ideas.
Yeah.
A 2-hour intro.
We actually got through a good bit, funny enough. Like a lot of what we did talk about actually covers quite a bit of it.
Cool.
Or at least like in a brief version. Like because we did talk about what change means. We talked about, you know, how his idea of form, what that is in relation to matter and composition, sort of, and then we talked about the unmoved mover to some extent. We sort of also talked about act or activity as being somehow equivalent, or how form expresses itself. So I mean, we did sort of touch the sections, really. Like we ended up.
So I guess next week will give us a chance, and maybe some other people who couldn't attend today, chance to catch up on Aristotle. People want to
do a little overview.
Yeah, and also like to get specific questions, because like not everything, like some of the phrases don't always make sense to everybody, like the explanation of it, or
and maybe we could
like,
try
for
to
example,
get an
like,
answer.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, yeah, go ahead. I was done.
I was gonna say maybe we can get an answer on whether anyone on this side of the discussion has addressed Aristotle's comments on Plato. I'm
I'm
sure
almost sure
someone
Gerson
has.
did. Gerson probably has. I just haven't read him.
Yeah.
Because he has a book that's called Aristotle and the Other Platonists.
Nice.
Um,
Yeah, surely it's in there. Or I was thinking also in maybe one of his interviews.
this is the book that I just posted. I think it's loading up. But yeah, yeah. So he apparently this is his big book where the whole thing is about. Like it's an expanded version of what Perl's doing here. Like he's trying to show how Aristotle is a Platonist, is should firmly be considered a Platonist philosopher, and that's kind of what he's arguing. So I have a feeling he probably does because he's very thorough. That guy's detailed as hell. Like,
Okay, cool, great. Yeah, I'll try to look through that. Obviously, I'm probably not going to try to read it before next week, but try to look for.
yeah, he has
bringing
a
my address
translation
up.
of the Enneads too. Actually,
Wow,
he's translated the Enneads as well.
nice,
Yeah, so he's a heavyweight in this whole thing.
cool.
And oddly an analytic philosopher though. It's weird. Very, very bizarre.
All right,
What is
guys.
your take on? Oh, well, actually, we could have that discussion some other time, but.
Oh, sorry. You got
Yeah.
I want to stop questions, but I'm more awake at night. Right now, I'm not.
Yeah, that's fine.
And we went on for our usual time anyway. This was like 3 hours. That's usually when we stop anyways. So
yeah,
we usually stop around now. So I think it worked out.
cool.
So, Justin, what were you gonna say? That was bothering me. I gotta hear your question.
Oh no, I was just gonna ask what your take, Naveed, is on analytic philosophy, because that was an interesting comment. I mean, I've never been the biggest fan of analytic philosophy. I think it has a function, but you were saying that it was surprising that he's an analytic philosopher, so I was wondering what you meant by that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, to be really brief with it, I mean, if you look at just sort of what analytic philosophy does overall, like it's not like the problem is analytic philosophy in principle. Because there's a sense in which analytic philosophy is trying to be very clear, very precise in certain kind of ways, and address some of the vagueness or hard to pin downness of continental. Like it's trying to have a different language, and so there's a sense in which that is really helpful, because if you look at Gerson, his stuff is remarkably clear. Like you can tell, like he doesn't talk like a continental. He talks so much like what you call like this really
Dry analytical.
yeah, like it's very to the point, nothing extra, nothing this or that, like a very precise use of terms, this and that, all that kind of stuff, and telling you exactly what every term is when he's saying it and whatever. So like that's there. But I guess the reason why it's surprising is a lot of analytic philosophy rejects the idea of just leaping into metaphysical ideas. Like there's a sense in which analytics believes in solving problems piecemeal or starting from particulars and moving upwards in a certain kind
That's
of
why I
way.
hate
And so
it.
that yeah, it tries to in a sense have this thing of like where it sticks to a certain part of things and believes that okay, well you can build up to that to some extent, but that continental does this weird skip that it shouldn't be able to do, or doesn't make sense or isn't responsible. So it's not necessarily that analytic is completely hostile to metaphysics, but a lot of people end up being sort of that way, mostly because analytic philosophy hasn't gotten there, or there's a sense in which it doesn't feel like our mind can go there just yet, sort of thing, or like or there's a debate of whether we could get there in the first place.
Interesting.
In some sense, and yeah, it has. I think it has less to do with just that analytic philosophy can't accommodate this stuff, and more to do with the nature of sort of how the founders of analytic philosophy have been using it and what's become the analytic tradition.
I've always kind of seen it as like, I don't know if the right term is reductionistic, but
Mhm.
yeah, I guess that's a good term for it. It's just like, ugh, like really, that's cringe.
Yeah, and but the logic for the reduction is saying, well, that's what we can all share as reality, and so like maybe it's reductionist, but we have to pretend that it isn't initially because you can't just extrapolate that there is something more, right? Like you have to start by reducing it, and then as you completely understand that, maybe you can expand further and say, oh, well then now that we get this, we can say, okay, maybe there's a bit more, and then you go further. So like in a sense, it's kind of a weird methodological thing that it's trying to do. Oddly
Yeah,
enough.
and I get that that's true in terms of like the conceptual space that we exist in, but from my vantage point, like we do actually all share the experience of being, and I start from that. It's sort of existential, just sort of classical at the same time.
Mhm.
Like Parmenides talking about it and all that, and it's like the analytical tradition exists in this weird modern space where we forget all that.
I think that's where Pearl's nod to phenomenology is really fun because phenomenology feels analytical. It's kind of on this kind of experiential on
Phenomenology,
the front.
yeah, that's what
It's like what are you experiencing? What are you encountering that you can like tell is real? But in the end, it's got its back end is it's like a different its software is analytical, but its back end is idealist classical. So it kind of communicates a lot of I don't know, I've met analytical. I was into this like little history of theology podcast thing, and they hated phenomenology. They thought Husserl was like the most idiot philosopher ever to get published because he just misunderstood what the philosophy was going to or was even trying to do. Because he kind of like backs up. He parks in like the analytical philosophy's like parking spot, and he's not them. You're not one of us. What are you doing here?
What was the name you mentioned again? What was his
Husserl?
name? Husserl. Oh yeah, okay.
Husserl, yeah. I'm pronouncing it wrong, but yeah. He was just. I heard this one guy. He was supposed to be. I thought this was unbiased history of philosophy. No, he's like, I hate this. He just says it like, I hate this philosopher. He's the worst. I think he's stupid.
Mhm. Yeah. But yeah, if anybody wants here's the Plotinus book. If anybody wants that one.
Cool. I've never gotten so many books as I've gotten in the last few months. Both from
I've got a bajillion PDFs because like I just go crazy on LibGen and just like whenever I hear about a new book, I download it immediately if I can find it. And so I literally have like my pirated book collection is enormous.
Wow.
I should have ended the recording before you said that, man.
Yeah, but both from
there are already more than enough things that anybody
give
would
us
know
this
that have been
philosophy books
that have
back.
shown up.
It's both from you guys and from Catholics. Like Catholics give away so many books, it's crazy. Awesome.
All right, guys. I'm gonna call this a wrap
Cool.
because I'm tired.